The first thing Lily Hart remembered about that morning was the color. Red and blue lights pulsing against the old bricks of Brooklyn sirens tearing the air apart like wild animals. She was only 6, clutching a faded blue scarf to her chin, her legs dangling off a wooden bench inside one police plaza. Through the glass doors, she saw her father, Daniel Hart, shoved into the back of a patrol car with handcuffs biting at his wrists. He turned his head one last time, his eyes frantic, and for Lily the world collapsed. How could a man who tucked her in every night with bedtime stories suddenly be treated like a criminal? If you were there, would you have believed he was guilty? Tell me in the comments, because what happens next will make you question everything about justice and fate. And I promise you this, there are shocking turns ahead that no one in that police station could have imagined. Hours stretched like years. The building smelled of burnt coffee and bleach. Phones rang. Officers laughed about last night's basketball game, and people brushed past without once looking at the little girl in the corner. She tried to count the gray tiles on the floor to keep from crying. 27, 28, 29, but her throat burned. The scarf around her neck had once belonged to her mother, who was gone now. Lily wrapped it tighter as if cloth could protect her from loneliness. Nobody asked if she was hungry, though her stomach growled loudly enough for her to feel embarrassed. Nobody explained why her father was taken except muttered words like inside job and grand larceny that meant nothing to a child. She felt invisible, a shadow in a city too busy to care. That's when the man in the charcoal suit walked in. He didn't look like anyone else in the precinct. His tie straight, his shoes polished, his steps unhurried, as though the floor itself owed him respect. His name was Grant Whitaker, a corporate lawyer whose face often appeared in magazines beside CEOs and mayors. He was young, rich, untouchable. But when he noticed Lily, something in him paused. He crouched, slightly careful not to wrinkle his suit. "Are you here by yourself?" he asked, his voice calm but unexpectedly warm. She nodded, gripping the scarf. He studied her a moment longer, then asked, "Are you hungry?" Before Lily could answer, her stomach betrayed her with another loud growl. For the first time all day, someone actually smiled at her. Grant disappeared briefly, and Lily assumed he wouldn't return. Adults never did. But he came back with a paper-wrapped grilled cheese and a carton of apple juice. He handed it to her like it was treasure. She unwrapped the sandwich with shaking fingers, inhaled the buttery smell, and took a bite that nearly made her cry. Between mouthfuls, she whispered her name and her father's. When Grant realized who her father was, Daniel Hart, the night watchman arrested that morning, his expression darkened. "Tell me," he said softly, "what do you know about what happened?" Lily answered the only way a child could. "My dad works nights so he can take me to school in the morning. He didn't do anything wrong." Grant rose, straightened his jacket, and walked to the front desk. His voice sharpened into the professional tone that won him million-dollar cases. Within minutes, he had details: the robbery at the shipping docks, the security system disabled at exactly 2:17 a.m., the fingerprints on the control panel belonging to Daniel Hart. "Open and shut," the sergeant said smugly. But Grant's sharp eyes caught something others missed: a suspicious 4-minute blackout in the security logs, always during the same manager's shift. A pattern nobody wanted to notice. He glanced back at Lily's scarf wrapped tightly around her small shoulders, watching him as if her whole world depended on his next word. And in that instant, Grant Whitaker, the man who never touched criminal defense, made a choice that would change both their lives. He marched back to the bench and crouched again. "I'm going to speak to your father," he told her. Lily blinked, unsure if she should believe him. "Really?" she whispered. He nodded. "Really?" She didn't know what a lawyer actually did, but in that moment she believed him more than she had believed anyone since the sirens split the dawn. She clutched her scarf, whispering the words her father always used. "It's going to be all right." Only this time, for the first time, she actually believed it. What she couldn't possibly know was that this man, this stranger in a perfect suit, was stepping into a storm far bigger than a robbery. He thought he was saving a night watchman and comforting a little girl, but fate had written a far crueler script. One day, decades later, that same billionaire would sit alone at a defendant's table, abandoned, accused, and disgraced. And the girl in the scarf, grown now into a lawyer herself, would be the one to stand beside him. Lily Hart grew up in a city that rarely forgave weakness. After her father's arrest and release, life never returned to normal. The bills kept piling, the apartment felt smaller, and the blue scarf that once comforted her became her daily shield. Yet, instead of folding under pressure, she learned to fight back in her own quiet way. At 12, she was reading newspapers at the public library, circling articles about wrongful convictions with a pencil she kept tucked behind her ear. By 14, she was writing short reflections on an old blog she called Shadows of Justice, her words raw but startlingly wise for her age. Nobody paid much attention then, but the seeds of a fighter were already planted. A high school at Columbia Prep was both a blessing and a battlefield. She earned her way there with scholarships and endless hours of studying, but the other kids noticed her thrift store clothes and the way she avoided talking about her family. Teachers saw brilliance. Classmates saw an outsider. To keep her head above water, Lily worked evenings at a coffee shop near Riverside Drive, serving cappuccinos to professors who sometimes recognized her from debate competitions. Debate was where she thrived. She didn't just argue points, she told stories weaving facts into human stakes. By her senior year, she was captain of the team, undefeated against rival schools, and already feared for the way she could dismantle an opponent's logic with a single sentence. It wasn't just skill, it was hunger. She needed to prove to herself and the world that she was more than the daughter of a man who once wore handcuffs. When a guidance counselor asked about her dream, she didn't hesitate. Law. Criminal defense. The counselor blinked, surprised. Most kids at her school said finance, medicine, or tech. Lily's answer was sharper, born of memory and defiance. College came with its own grind. Columbia University accepted her on merit, but scholarships only covered so much. She pulled double shifts at the coffee shop, took tutoring gigs on weekends, and sometimes skipped meals to stretch her budget. She kept her blog alive now, writing longer posts under a pseudonym. When podcasts exploded in popularity, she recorded her essays with a second-hand microphone, her voice steady and unpolished. "Justice isn't just a word carved in stone above courthouse doors," she said in one early episode. "It's the difference between a child going home or watching their family vanish into a system that doesn't care." At first, only a handful of listeners tuned in. Then, a local columnist stumbled upon her work and quoted her. The next day, her subscriber count doubled. Still, success didn't shield her from exhaustion. More than once, she fell asleep on the late-night M60 bus with casebooks sprawled across her lap. She studied in corners of the New York Public Library's scarf draped across her chair like a banner she carried from childhood. She memorized constitutional amendments like prayer and practiced oral arguments in front of bathroom mirrors, her voice echoing back at her in the quiet of 2 a.m. Her determination caught the eye of the public defender's office. During her second year of law school, she was offered an internship. It was unpaid, of course, but Lily accepted anyway. She couldn't forget the bench in the police station, or the way nobody cared enough to ask if she was hungry. She wanted to be the person who noticed. Her first case as a student assistant was a teenager accused of stealing headphones from a department store. The evidence was flimsy, the arrest sloppy, but the boy's family didn't have $1 for representation. Lily poured herself into the file, combing through store surveillance, cross-referencing timestamps with receipts. In court, under her supervising attorney's watchful eye, she delivered her findings. The charges were dismissed. It wasn't a headline case, but the boy's mother wept in the hallway, clutching Lily's hands as if she'd saved their whole future. That night, Lily went home and recorded a new podcast episode, her voice trembling for the first time. The law, she said, isn't just for the powerful. It's supposed to be for us all. She kept stacking experiences like bricks. Another case involved a cab driver accused of assaulting a passenger. The story made headlines, painted him guilty before trial. Lily dug deeper. She found inconsistencies in the accuser's statements, tracked down a witness who had been ignored, and presented the information to her supervising attorney. This time, it led to a reduced charge, sparing the driver from losing his license. Small victories, yes, but they gave her a taste of what justice could look like when someone refused to let the overlooked stay invisible. Throughout these years, Lily received help she couldn't quite explain. A scholarship arrived under the name Whitaker Trust, though she never confirmed its connection to Grant. A stack of legal textbooks appeared one semester already paid for at the campus bookstore. She suspected, but never asked. Maybe it was pride, or maybe she wasn't ready to reopen that door. She chose instead to focus on the work in front of her, determined to earn everything twice over. When her peers celebrated internships at corporate firms with glossy receptions and catered dinners, Lily stayed late at the public defender's office, sifting through manila folders. "You'll burn out," a professor warned her once. She smiled, tired but unbroken. "Better to burn out doing something that matters," she replied. In quiet moments, she walked along Riverside Park, looking out over the Hudson, the city lights shimmering like promises. The scarf trailed around her neck, older now, frayed beyond repair, but still with her. It wasn't just fabric. It was memory, survival, and resolve stitched into every thread. By the time she reached her final year of law school, her podcast had grown into a small but loyal community. Listeners sent in stories of injustice, families reached out asking for guidance, and strangers thanked her for speaking out. She never thought of herself as a voice of anything, just a girl trying to make sense of a broken system. But her inbox proved otherwise. People were listening. People needed her. And though she didn't know it yet, the choices she made in those years, the late nights, the quiet victories, the refusal to give up, were laying the foundation for a confrontation she never could have imagined. One day, she would walk into a courtroom and face the man who had once saved her family. And this time, she wouldn't be the child clutching a scarf in silence. She would be the one standing tall, ready to return the favor. For years, Grant Whitaker had been the man people pointed to when they spoke of power in Manhattan. He wasn't just wealthy, he was untouchable. Courtrooms bent to his precision, boardrooms opened at his command, and city leaders sought his endorsement. His offices overlooked the Oculus Transit Hub, a gleaming symbol of progress, and his name appeared in glossy magazines beside politicians and celebrities. To most, he was the golden lawyer who never lost. But giants rarely fall gently. Grant's collapse began quietly, almost invisibly, with signatures on documents he didn't remember signing, and numbers that didn't add up until it was far too late. It started with whispers. A pension fund client noticed discrepancies. Then another investor raised questions about overseas transfers routed through accounts in Lisbon and Dubai. At first, Grant dismissed it as clerical error. His firm handled billions and mistakes were inevitable. But then the headlines hit. Whitaker under scrutiny. Star lawyer tied to offshore schemes. The photographs were merciless, showing him stepping out of a black car, his jaw clenched. His once flawless confidence shaded into something closer to fear. His partners, Evan Cross and Jenna Vale, played their parts with tragic perfection. They stood beside him at press conferences offering solidarity while quietly feeding regulators doctored emails and forged authorizations. Each document bore his electronic signature, each trail led back to him, and the walls began to close in. The public devoured the story. Talk shows debated his downfall. Financial analysts dissected his choices as if they had been there all along. A former client went on a podcast shaking her head about the arrogance of men like Whitaker. Even people who once begged for his time now distanced themselves, saying they'd always suspected. His wealth, his reputation, his very identity became poison. On social media, strangers called him a thief, a fraud, a hypocrite. Some reveled in his collapse, posting memes of his face behind prison bars. The man who had once defined control now found himself hunted by the very system he had mastered. The humiliation grew sharper when the Sotheby's auction catalog appeared. His art collection, once curated with taste and restraint, was now reduced to numbered lots. A Rothko that once hung in his living room, a Degas sketch gifted by a client, even the silver fountain pen he had carried into countless trials, each listed for bidding, each described as assets seized for liquidation. Watching strangers raise their hands for pieces of his life was a torment, unlike any courtroom battle he had ever fought. He attended the auction in silence, a dark coat over his shoulders, no one recognizing the man who used to command every room. When the fountain pen sold, a chill settled in his chest. It had been more than an object, it was part of his identity now lost to the highest bidder. His license was suspended soon after. The Bar Association called it temporary, but the word carried no comfort. His accounts were frozen, his staff scattered, and the gleaming office on the 40th floor was stripped bare within weeks. He moved into a hotel near Penn Station, a place where nobody cared who he had been. The carpets smelled of mildew, the walls thin enough to hear arguments next door. Each morning, he walked the streets of Manhattan unnoticed, a man reduced to anonymity. The very invisibility he had once envied in others now felt like suffocation. At night, he replayed the betrayal. Evan's reassuring pats on the back, Jenna's soft promises that everything would blow over, all revealed now as lies carefully constructed to keep him still while the trap closed. He thought of the young attorneys he had mentored, many of whom now avoided his calls. Loyalty, it seemed, was as fragile as glass. And yet there was more than anger in him. There was shame, too, because he realized how blind he had been, how convinced of his own invincibility that he hadn't seen the knife sliding into his back. The city itself seemed to mock him. Billboards displayed smiling attorneys with slogans like, "Integrity you can trust," while the news tickers below ran his name with the word fraud attached. He became a case study in hubris, the cautionary tale professors cited in ethics classes. And perhaps, worst of all, he had no one to turn to. For all his wealth, he had never built a true circle of friends. Power had been his company, and power had fled. One evening, walking through the Oculus with its white steel ribs arching like wings overhead, Grant stopped and stared at the commuters rushing past. Their lives, ordinary and unshaken, reminded him of what he had once overlooked. He had measured everything by winning and wealth, never realizing how quickly it could vanish. The noise of footsteps echoed through the cavernous hall, each one a reminder that the world moved on without him. He stood there for almost an hour, just another man leaning against the rail, unnoticed and unimportant. But beneath the despair, a flicker remained. Grant knew he had been set up. The signatures, the timelines, the too perfect evidence, it all pointed to a conspiracy designed with surgical precision. He could almost admire the craftsmanship if it weren't destroying his life. He told himself that one day he would prove it. One day he would find the thread and pull it until the whole lie unraveled. But for now he had nothing but shadow suspicion and the echo of his own name spoken with contempt. His fall was not just financial. It was personal, spiritual, absolute. The man who had once stood at the peak of New York's legal world now sat alone on a sagging mattress, the city's noise filtering through the window. He had defended corporations, politicians, billionaires. He had been called brilliant, ruthless, unstoppable. Now he was none of those things. He was simply a man stripped bare, waiting for anyone to believe him. And in that emptiness, though he didn't know it, yet destiny was circling back. Somewhere in the same city, a young lawyer named Lily Hart was working late nights at the public defender's office, sharpening the very skills that would one day decide his fate. For now, Grant's story was one of disgrace and betrayal, but storms have a way of clearing the air. And even giants who fall can find themselves one day standing again, but only if someone is willing to fight for them. The public defender's office was always crowded on Monday mornings. Clients shuffled in with hollow eyes, clutching paperwork they barely understood. The air smelled of stale coffee and exhaustion, but to Lily Hart it felt like purpose. She had spent years preparing for this exact place, years of study sacrifice and grit. But nothing prepared her for the man who walked through those doors that morning. His once polished shoes were scuffed, his coat frayed at the seams. His face carried lines deeper than the last time she had seen him on television. It was Grant Whitaker, the giant who had once towered over Manhattan. He looked smaller now, but to Lily he was unmistakable. She froze, every memory flooding back: the grilled cheese, the scarf, the promise he had made to a little girl long ago. The clerk at intake barely glanced at him before scribbling his name on the list. "Assigned counsel," the clerk muttered. When the file landed on Lily's desk, her heart stopped. She stared at the name on the folder, the charges, the stakes: fraud, conspiracy, Whitaker v. United States. She whispered the name aloud as if it might vanish if she said it wrong. Grant Whitaker. The man who once defended her father. Now the system was devouring him, and fate had delivered him into her hands. When they finally sat face to face in the cramped interview room, Grant didn't recognize her. His eyes scanned the peeling paint on the wall, then her face with polite detachment. He had learned not to trust anyone. But Lily leaned forward, her voice steady. "You don't remember me," she said. He shook his head. She reached into her case folder and pulled out a pen. Not his, not the silver one he had lost, but her own. She laid it flat on the table between them. Years ago, she whispered, "I was a little girl in a scarf sitting on a bench at the One Police Plaza. You bought me a sandwich and told me everything was going to be all right. You saved my father." For a long moment he didn't move. Then slowly, his eyes widened. Recognition spread across his face like light cracking through clouds. He swallowed hard. "Lily," he murmured. She finished for him. "I'm your lawyer now." His breath caught. For the first time in years, he seemed unsure what to say. The man who once commanded boardrooms now sat silent, humbled by a twist he could never have written himself. The case was brutal from the start. The prosecution's files were stacked high, each page filled with damning details: emails, contracts, approvals, all bearing Grant's name. To anyone glancing through it, looked airtight. But Lily had spent her life learning how to read between the lines, how to notice the detail that others ignored. She pored over the evidence night after night, cross-referencing dates, times, even the fonts on the documents. Something felt too clean, too perfect. That's when she noticed the microdots, tiny yellow specks printed on every page, invisible to the naked eye, unless you knew where to look. Each speck was a timestamp, a printer's fingerprint. And the timeline they revealed didn't match the prosecution's story. These documents had been altered. Her discovery sent her into a storm of investigation. She filed FOIA requests, subpoenaed backup servers, and tracked down a janitor who remembered odd late-night printing sessions. She traced metadata across time zones, uncovering emails supposedly sent from New York at hours when Grant was provably in Washington. Piece by piece, she built a map of manipulation, a conspiracy orchestrated by Evan Cross and Jenna Vale, the very people who had once called Grant their partner. They had weaponized his reputation using his signature and access to carry out fraud while ensuring every breadcrumb pointed back to him. The deeper she dug, the darker it became. One evening, a man in a tailored suit approached her outside the Roosevelt Island tram. He introduced himself as Robert Kelly, a concerned friend of powerful people. He offered her an envelope thick with cash in exchange for softening her defense. She refused, her voice calm, but her hands trembled as she recorded every word on her phone. Later that night, she sat alone with the scarf draped across her lap, reminding herself why she fought. It wasn't just about Grant. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been invisible. The trial was a war. Prosecutors painted Grant as arrogant, greedy, the architect of the scheme. They paraded witnesses, displayed forged contracts, and whispered to the press about his fall from grace. The jury leaned against him from the start, but Lily refused to flinch. She cross-examined with precision, dismantling half-truths one by one. She called the janitor who spoke about the smell of ozone and toner on nights when Grant wasn't there. She called a cloud vendor who explained how the email headers revealed manipulation across time zones. And then, with quiet authority, she held up a page of evidence to the jury. "Do you see these dots?" she asked. "They're not stains. They're microcodes. They tell us when and where this page was printed. And it wasn't when the government claims." The courtroom went still. For the first time, the prosecution looked unsettled. Lily pressed forward, weaving the dots into a story of betrayal, greed, and calculated framing. She didn't plead for sympathy. She offered proof. Cold, irrefutable proof. Every word was sharpened by years of grit, by nights in libraries, by the memory of sitting invisible on a bench while her father was taken away. She wasn't just defending Grant. She was defending every version of herself that had ever been told to stay quiet. But the most searing test came when her own father was pulled into the narrative. Evidence surfaced showing that years ago, Daniel Hart had unknowingly done small delivery jobs for Evan Cross, carrying sealed envelopes that later tied into the fraudulent scheme. He was called to the stand. Lily's heart nearly broke, watching him tremble under oath. He admitted the truth. He hadn't known what he was carrying, but he hadn't asked questions either. Shame lined his face. Lily's voice shook as she questioned him, torn between daughter and attorney. But she found the strength to press forward. She needed the jury to see not just his weakness, but the larger trap. By exposing her own father's mistakes, she revealed the scale of the corruption, the way Cross and Vale used ordinary people as pawns. The courtroom was electric when she delivered her closing. She didn't shout. She didn't dramatize. She stood, steady, her blue scarf draped over the lectern like a banner. Justice isn't about who has the loudest voice or the deepest pockets, she told the jury. It's about truth. And the truth is written right here in these dots, in this timeline, in the lives of the people betrayed by those who thought they were untouchable. Grant Whitaker is not guilty of their crimes. He is guilty only of trusting the wrong people. And if you convict him, you won't be punishing a fraud, you'll be rewarding one. Her words cut through the courtroom like a blade. She glanced at Grant, who sat watching her with eyes heavy but alive, as if for the first time he truly understood what it meant to be defended, not for his power, but for his humanity. For him, it was the most humbling moment of his life. For Lily, it was the culmination of every long night, every sacrifice, every vow she had ever made to never let another innocent person vanish without a fight. The verdict was still days away, but something had already shifted. The jury leaned forward when she spoke. The press, once eager to bury Grant, now scribbled frantic notes about the young defender who had turned the case upside down. In the silence after her closing, one thing was certain: Lily Hart had arrived. And the girl once left invisible in a police station was now the woman who refused to let anyone look away. The morning the verdict was read, Foley Square was brimming with reporters. Cameras clustered at the courthouse steps, microphones lined up like bayonets. Inside, the air was heavier than stone. Grant Whitaker sat at the defense table, shoulders squared, but hands clasped tightly in front of him. He no longer looked like the giant who once ruled Manhattan. He looked like a man holding his breath, waiting for the final strike. Beside him, Lily Hart stood tall, her notes untouched. She had done everything she could. The rest belonged to 12 strangers behind a door. When the jury filed back into the room, the silence was total. Lily's heartbeat thudded in her ears as the foreman handed the paper to the clerk. The judge's voice cut through the stillness. On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, how do you find the defendant? The pause lasted only seconds, but felt like an eternity. Not guilty. Murmurs erupted, cameras clicked. Grant closed his eyes, his jaw trembling. On the count of securities fraud, the judge continued. Not guilty. The words hit like thunder. Each charge was read, each verdict the same. Not guilty. Grant slumped forward, his hands covering his face. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to break. Lily reached for him, resting her hand gently on his shoulder. She had not only saved a man, she had restored a life that others had tried to erase. Across the aisle, prosecutors sat stunned, their case dismantled by details too precise to ignore. Reporters dashed from the courtroom to broadcast the news. By the time Grant and Lily stepped outside, the story had already changed. The disgraced Titan had become the man vindicated, and beside him the world saw a young lawyer with fire in her voice and steel in her spine. But Lily knew this wasn't just about one trial. That night, she visited her father. Daniel Hart had been shaken by the trial, his reluctant testimony forcing him to face his past. He sat at the community mural he had begun helping paint a wall of names and stories of those wrongfully accused. When Lily arrived, he looked at her with a mixture of pride and regret. "I never wanted you to carry all this weight," he said softly. She sat beside him, slipping her hand into his. "You gave me enough strength to carry it," she answered. For the first time in years, their silence was no longer filled with guilt, but with peace. Grant, meanwhile, rejected the flood of offers that came pouring in. Television networks wanted interviews. Publishers waived book contracts. Investors promised a comeback empire. He declined them all. He had seen what fortune built on ego could become. Instead, he disappeared quietly to California. On a rocky stretch of coast near Carmel by the sea, he purchased a modest house overlooking the ocean. There, he opened a legal aid center for those with nowhere else to turn: immigrants, single mothers, men whose names the world would never remember. He wrote no press releases, gave no interviews. He simply showed up day after day, offering the defense he once thought too small for his time. Before he left New York, he had given Lily a small package. Inside was a simple brass key attached to a note written in his careful hand, for when someone needs a door to open. She kept it in her desk drawer at the public defender's office, a quiet reminder of how one act of kindness could ripple across decades. She had already launched the Wrongful Horizon Fund, channeling her growing podcast audience into donations that provided emergency defense costs for those trapped in the system. Families who once faced silence now had a lifeline. Years later, in a crowded waiting room, Lily spotted a young boy sitting alone on a hard bench, clutching a worn backpack. His mother had been taken in on charges he didn't understand. He looked lost and visible, just as she once had. Lily walked over, crouched so her eyes met his, and draped her old blue scarf around his shoulders. "You're not alone," she told him. The boy looked up, startled by the sudden kindness. In that moment, the cycle completed itself. What Grant had done for her, she now carried forward, one case, one child, one family at a time. The ending of their story was not written in headlines or wealth. It was written in the quiet choices that matter most. The father who sought redemption with a paintbrush, the billionaire who traded power for service, and the girl who grew into a defender of the invisible. None of their lives were perfect. None of their roads were easy, but together they proved a truth worth remembering. Justice is never a gift from the powerful. It is earned by those who refuse to look away. And sometimes the smallest act, a sandwich, shared a scarf, given a promise kept, is enough to change everything. In the end, the story of Lily Hart and Grant Whitaker was never just about a trial or a courtroom victory, or the vindication of a man who had lost everything. It was about the unseen threads that bind lives together across time, across tragedy, and across choices that define who we are. A frightened little girl once sat on a cold police station bench, invisible to everyone, except a man who stopped, noticed, and decided her pain mattered. That moment, almost too small to measure at the time, grew into a seed that carried Lily through years of hardship, study, and sacrifice. For Grant, that simple act of humanity would circle back decades later in the most unexpected way. He, the man who had built empires and shattered glass ceilings, found himself reduced to nothing, disgraced, abandoned, falsely accused of crimes that threatened to erase his entire legacy. And when the world turned its back, the girl he once helped reappeared. But she was no longer just the child clutching a scarf and a teddy bear. She was a lawyer forged by grit and shaped by her own struggles, standing in front of him to say, "I believe you." Their story reminds us that lives are rarely straight lines. They are loops, spirals, intersecting paths where kindness today can become salvation tomorrow. Daniel Hart, Lily's father, embodied another truth, that even those who falter, even those who compromise under pressure, can still choose redemption. His testimony cost him his pride, but it also gave him peace. And Grant the giant, who once thought his worth was measured in skyscrapers and clients, discovered a deeper wealth in serving the forgotten along the California coast. What does this mean for us? Watching from the distance of our own lives, it means that no act of kindness is wasted even when it feels small. The sandwich offered to a hungry child, the gentle words spoken to someone invisible in a crowd, the decision to stand beside another human being when everyone else walks away. These choices ripple forward in ways we cannot predict. It also means that integrity, though costly, though often lonely, remains the most valuable currency we have. Grant's empire crumbled because trust was betrayed, but his life was rebuilt on the only foundation that lasts: truth. Lily's refusal to take shortcuts, even when offered bribes and temptations, reminds us that real victory is not about what we win, but about who we become in the process. And for every one of us navigating a world that feels faster, colder, and more divided, their journey offers a map. We may not all stand in a courtroom, but we face our own trials, daily choices about honesty, compassion, and courage. The lesson is to show up for people even when it costs you. Stand for truth even when it shakes your comfort. And believe as Lily did that one small act can light a path through decades of darkness. So the next time you find yourself in front of someone who seems invisible, ask yourself, what if my kindness today becomes their reason to fight tomorrow? That is a legacy worth leaving. Not titles, not wealth, but the proof that we made the world just a little less cruel, a little more just, and a little more human. If this story has moved you, if it has reminded you of the power of compassion and the importance of justice, Then I ask you to take one small step for this channel. Subscribe. By subscribing, you help us bring more stories like this to life stories that don't just entertain but inspire, stories that challenge us to be better, braver, and kinder. Your support is the reason we can keep going, and together we can make sure these lessons reach more hearts around the world. So click that button, join our community, and let's keep uncovering the stories that prove one truth again and again: no act of kindness is ever too small, and no fight for justice is ever truly lost.